Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Business Fusion. I am your host, Philip de la Vega, accompanied by my co-host, Carlos Raldiris. Today, we are joined by Gisele Marcus. She's a TEDx speaker, an accomplished executive, extensive experience making organizations hum. Gisele, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here with you two gentlemen.
It's our pleasure. Please give us a little more background on you. Early experience, how you got here. What are you up to nowadays?
I have a proven track record of success in operations, and that's across 4 companies. So I've primarily been in Fortune 200 companies. So Johnson Controls, Accenture, AT&T, Thermo Fisher Scientific. And in those companies, I've typically held general manager roles where I've had the responsibility for both operations and sales. But I would say typically it would lead to 80% ops, 20% sales. And then I did do a brief stint at a nonprofit as the chief operating officer and executive vice president of strategic initiatives and operations. And that was at the St. Louis Regional Chamber, where I had oversight for all of our back office operations. And it was really somewhat of a continuation of my corporate career, and with responsibility for HR, IT, customer service, facility management, CRM, the Office of Finance and Accounting, strategy. So really it was somewhat, like I said, a continuation of the career I had in corporate, but actually working in a nonprofit environment, which I actually enjoyed, because within those large corporate structures, as you know, typically you'll have a direct team and you'll have a matrix team in the corporate structure.
Right.
And I missed was just having that direct line to all of operations, which is why I did the pivot to nonprofit, because people look at my background, they often say, oh my gosh, you were in corporate for, pretty much a quarter of a century. What made you go into nonprofit? So it was really because it gave me the opportunity to have ownership of the entire back office, and I absolutely loved it.
Right. So tell us a little bit about what it's like to lead people as a COO.
Yes. And I've had the opportunity to lead an organization as large as 1,200, a global team across 40 countries, 5 continents. And the truth of the matter is, clearly, there isn't a cookie cutter approach. So let's just start with that. And in terms of the leaders that actually report to me, I would always make it my business to understand where they want to go with their career. You shouldn't just assume that because you inherit people that they want to stay where they are. So one key thing around people is really their development of their career. So that's an area that I like to focus on. And in so knowing, if there's an opportunity, if someone wants to move somewhere else and it's in the same business, that's actually great, because that way, at least they're in the same organization. So I'm actually happy to do that. Or there have been instances, particularly when I was at the smaller location at the St. Louis Regional Chamber. And, because it's a smaller organization, there isn't as much upward opportunity. But because I was in that organization, we're very much tied to other organizations within the region. So I would actually try to help my employees, go to other companies that were actually investors in us. So I would say career development is one of the components, but also it's ensuring that your leaders have the fortitude to be a leader. So what is it? Because typically my direct reports would actually have direct reports. So do they have all of the qualities that a leader would have? And if there's something that's missing, because we all have missing or that needs development, because I believe that we all have that at all times, really being attentive to that. And personally, for myself, I've had an executive coach for about 14 years. So I often encourage my direct reports to have one too, because sometimes direct reports don't want to talk to their boss about some of the issues that they're facing, right? And they want a third party. And, we're adults, so I can actually trust them to actually mine their own career. So that's an area where I actually focus on as well.
It's kind of a timely topic. We are interviewing you really as part of our leadership series, right? We're talking to a number of people who, we'd consider to be kind of experts on leadership. And as a COO, clearly, you've had lots of time to develop your craft, so to speak. One of the things that I'm also kind of keen on understanding is, how did you get to that point, right? I mean, you make a good case for why it is that, a coach is a good thing, a mentor is certainly a good thing. How have they helped shape, even your own career decisions? Talk to us about that.
So very interestingly. So I would say that I want to talk about a sponsor, if that's okay, that really helped shape my career. So I was asked to go on an expatriate assignment to Johannesburg, South Africa, in a company that when you go on an expat assignment, they do not necessarily tell you what your next step is. I know like GE traditionally would do that. They would tell you doing this, you're going over here. And then when you get back, these are your next two moves. Well, the company that I was at wasn't that forthcoming. So when you went on an expat assignment, you had to move yourself out of the job that you're in. And then you had to figure out when you got back what you were going to do. And I found that to be somewhat concerning. So I went to talk to the gentleman who signed, which was the VP GM of my business, reported to our CEO, to understand how that works, because he signed off on all of the expat assignments. So he's seen, a good number of expats come in, come out, return. And what he explained to me was, he said, you have to make sure that you come back every quarter, to the mothership, to headquarters. Yeah. And in doing that, make sure you meet with your mentors, you meet with your sponsors. And he told me a story that still sticks with me today about a gentleman, let's just say he's named Jim, who went to Europe for 3 years, showed back up at the office 3 years later. There were leaders that didn't even know him. So he shows up and he's like, well, hey, I'm back. And they're like, well, who are you? I was like, oh my God, I don't want to be him. So how can I help myself? So the advice that he gave me about coming back every quarter, I took it. I ran with it. I made sure, and for each mentor and for him as my sponsor, and he actually in that moment said, see your mentor and your sponsors, of which I will be your sponsor. And I thought that was magnificent because he was very well respected within the company. So followed the instructions. And I ended up, when I got back from my assignment, I actually had 11 internal offers.
Wow.
So I would say that is one of the turning points in my career. And it really gave me, I would say out of that 11 offers, there were 3 that I seriously considered with my sponsor. And one of them was actually to stay in Africa and pretty much be like a country manager, continent manager. And then there was the one to actually run an $800 million business, which was like the largest general manager role that I've had with the in the 40 countries. And then there was another that was really more a role in regard to compliance. So my sponsor loved South Africa. That's where I was. But he said, my concern about you being the country manager is, quite honestly, he said, we're not going to be investing a lot of resources there. So that's the other thing about having mentors and sponsors. Mm-hmm. They give you some key information. And then I started thinking, that's why when I was there, I would ask for, resources that usually would have to come from Europe. And they would say, oh, well, that person's busy. That person's in the States doing this, or that person, is in Australia doing this. And I'm like, well, when am I? So I was like, and you need resources to get things done. You can't create them from out of the air. I mean, I'm pretty good at most things, but not at that. Yeah. So that was actually a refreshing way, to be sponsored and to actually end up having a great situation in the end, and to end up with the job that I actually wanted. Because while you're working, we always are desirous of what that next thing is. And sometimes we get it. Sometimes we don't. But I got it. But I think it has a lot to do with my sponsor and the fact that there's someone speaking on your behalf in the room when you're not in the room that you can't be in.
Right.
I believe that in conjunction with having a mentor is essential if you're wanting or desirous of a career where you have an upward trajectory.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I mean, Philip, you have probably had some good sponsorship in your life as well. Would you say?
Uh, yeah, I think I agree with that 100%. First time I heard that, and I think we both know of all three of us, Carla Harris, right, who has a great speaker, accomplished individual, and defines the differences between sponsor, and a mentor, and how important it is to have the sponsor. And had I not been a sponsor to move from, let's say, a divisional CFO role to become general management without the general management experience, I probably wouldn't have had that as opportunity going to a different company, right? So I agree with you, Gisele, many times these sponsors change your life, and they have the power to be able to do that basically overnight. So your business, your career track could be going this way, but all of a sudden it just goes like that. And I think that it's important for a lot of the younger audience to realize that it is good to nurture that or find that early on.
No, it's a really, really great point. And just to stick with that theme for a little while, if people who are listening to this podcast are in that place where they're really thinking about how to get a sponsor, what they need to do in order to make themselves quote unquote worthy of a sponsor, what kind of advice might you give them?
Well, I would say first you have to do the basic blocking and tackling, right? So you have to do what's in your job description. So that's just the entry point.
Right.
You have to find ways to differentiate yourself so that those that are in the executive suite take notice of you. So for example, this gentleman who became my sponsor, I didn't realize he had been watching me because, he even mentioned in this meeting, he's like, and he was just talking about different things that he knew about my career. And it's not, I didn't tell him these things, but somehow they made the way to his office. And I would say I often color outside the lines. So in the roles that I've had, I often take on additional roles that aren't within my job description, but things that I enjoy doing. So I often find myself working within affinity networks, being an African-American woman. It's important for me, to see others that look like me that are growing in their career, being able to move up within an organization. So I have worked with sponsors of those affinity groups in terms of creating DE&I strategies, evangelizing strategies, implementing strategies. And it's not because someone asked me, but because it was a strategic initiative of the organization. I thought that I could add value, and I was able to do that. And I believe that when people see you raising your hand to volunteer to do something that's not part of your job description, that is one way, to actually get noticed. The other thing is to take an interest in the executives in your organization. Understand things about them other than their title and their name. With the internet, you can go and find out a lot. So like my sponsor, for example, that I'm speaking of, he was a triathlete. So every time that I would come back from South Africa, I would bring something, a South Africa hat, a South Africa racing jacket, something that he could use for the triathlon. So take an interest in them as well. People like when you know something about them that's just not, the ordinary thing. So take that extra step. And the last thing that I would say, particularly for those that are younger in their career that you mentioned, is consider that your sponsor or your mentor doesn't necessarily have to look like you. I believe that, I do a lot of speaking engagements around networking, and it's a fact. People tend to gravitate toward people that look like them, that are similar to them. And quite honestly, when you think about the room that you're not in, where the decisions are made to make promotions, the people in the room may not look like you.
Right.
Make an effort to spread yourself around and question yourself about the people that are around you. And that's in a 360 format, not just those that are above you, but, your peers and, who else do you actually gather with for lunch? So I would say keep that in mind. And I think that's a very essential point in terms of having an upward career trajectory.
Great advice.
No, that definitely. Look, coincidentally, I think like the three of us are people of color, if you will, accomplished executives nonetheless. But I take your point 100%, Gisele. You have to be aware of your whole environment and not just paint yourself as just one single individual that only has one side to his or her personality. Having said that, however, and in all transparency, there are some challenges to come up in the corporate ladder, in the executive world. I mean, I feel very comfortable saying that we've been blessed, lucky, whatever you want to say, that all three of us have been able to accomplish some levels of responsibility that not many people do. And it's not an easy journey, but also that needs to be addressed because it is still there, right? But it should not be used as a handicap, if you will. I think more than anything, it enriches your perspective that you bring to the table.
Correct. And I agree. There was a time where, as I shared, I've had 4 general manager roles, and I was aspirational for the COO title for about 18 months to 2 years.
Okay.
While working, I spent time seeking out these roles, applying for these roles, wanting to interview for these roles, and it didn't happen, right? And I think that, my resume is pretty laser tight. I also have a Harvard MBA, which is often a good entry point, at least for people to be curious to what.
That's an accomplishment in itself.
That it is. But I will tell you that, for that period of time, I'll be honest, I actually gave up because I was like, you know what? As far as like my salary, income, I'm happy with it. Maybe I'm just not supposed to have the title. And I don't want to just say I didn't get it because I am a brown girl from Harlem. But that does it plays a factor because it goes back to people, enjoy and hire and associate with people that look like them. And typically when you're being hired to be a COO, you're being hired by a CEO.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't any CEOs that look like us. So, you're starting at a place where, it can be a challenge, but I just really, it's like, I try not to let it get inside of me, I guess is the point. And I just kept the confidence that even though it wasn't working, that I was still qualified for it. But what I will say is this, look at every single opportunity. Even if you're not officially looking for a new opportunity, always just be open to see what's out there. Because what happened to me, the way I was able to get the COO title, a young lady from Heidrick & Struggles, executive search firm, actually called me about the COO opportunity at the St. Louis Regional Chamber. Now, I want to say 2, 3, 4 years before, she had called me about maybe 3 different opportunities. I want to say of the 3, 2 got to maybe like the first step with the client, but it didn't go all the way through. But I'm always, thankful. You send the thank you note, you keep in touch with them. And, 3, 4 years later, she called me. She's like, hey, I think I have a job that is perfect for you. She said, I remember you told me you were interested in being a COO. I have a COO role. And she said, before you tell me no, hear me out. So I said, okay. And what she shared, I was like, that sounds amazing. And then I was off to the races and it happened. So, sometimes I feel that I need to be the one doing the doing all the time and doing the work and making the interviews happen. And sometimes, it happens as a result of relationships you have built prior. So I say all that to say, make sure that as you build and develop relationships, particularly for people that are young in your career, never blow anything off. Always to use every opportunity as an opportunity to add someone that you actually know and have interacted with into your network. You just never know how it can be a blessing. And if you want to take that to an extra degree, figure out how you want to keep in contact with that person on a regular basis.
Absolutely. I agree with that. Going back to the COO role, I mean, I think there are some basic skills. I mean, technology is just making things more dynamic nowadays. That's just inevitable. But there are some basic skills for COOs or many executives, to be honest, that haven't changed over the last 20, 30, 50 years or so. For instance, you need to have a solid relationship with the CEO, right? There needs to be trust. Clearly, there needs to be a sense of urgency. I mean, you are the one that is executing the plan, whatever that might be. Implementation of metrics. Everything needs to be measured, right? My experience is you have to be an egoless leader. If your ego gets in the way of leading others, then you may make the wrong decisions. Clearly, you have to have a holistic business view, and where possible, some industry experience. But those are basic skills that most CEOs would have. What are some of the skills, perhaps, that we can cover that have evolved, over the years? And I'll throw one in, which is, and I listened to it recently. They're saying like nowadays, the biggest asset an executive must have is adaptability, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, well, you're right. That's time. And to the point earlier, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or just the marketplace, things are changing. You must adapt. What other things have you encountered that you're like, what, over the last 5 years, I have to take on these new skills to be more effective?
Mm-hmm. So 2 things I would say I'm seeing, particularly for COO roles, a number of them are requiring technology oversight, which therefore is coming with, well, have you done this? Have you led an IT implementation recently? And have you done it in this particular industry? Mm-hmm. So I'm seeing that a lot because like has already been said here, technology is, taking us into the future. So I'm seeing that as one thing. And then secondarily, I would say the other item would be the ability to be nimble and flexible. Because I feel when I was younger, the job was the job. Like, you do the job, for 5 years, it's kind of the same job. But I'm noticing now with the role of the COO, it changes in that, you may have a situation when you go into the role where, let's say, you're dealing with strategy concerns or, maybe strategies haven't been met very well. So you go in and you solve that. Well, then now you realize, oh my goodness, the employee engagement survey said that we have a culture. Mm-hmm. So then you have to go, to try to resolve that. Then it's like, oh my gosh, 2 of our largest, investors, have decided they want to no longer invest in us. And then that becomes what I'm saying is, as a COO, the challenge that you have each day is not the same as the one you had yesterday or last month or last year. So being nimble, being open, and also just being able to, I say critical thinking is really important because any problem that you face, you may not have ever seen it before in your life, but you need to be able to know how to solve it. And sometimes what I do for that is I think about transferring other things that I've done in other industries to apply to the industry that I'm in. So I found that to actually be helpful because just because it's a different industry, it doesn't mean you can't apply something very similar to the problem that you're facing. So nimbleness, I would say, is also important, and a knowledge of technology and a comfort with it.
Great. One of the things, as I'm listening to you describe that, I'm thinking about some of the, the folks that I've worked with at the most senior levels of organizations. And the one thing that hasn't come up, but which I think is kind of, hidden here, or at least, it's sitting in the background, is that, leaders have to be great communicators as well. right? So think about everything you just described, the speed of change, the speed with which we need to adapt to those kinds of things. But, there is, at the end of all of this, especially if you're a senior in an organization, you've got a bunch of people that you've got to get aligned to that idea as well. People who have their own needs, their own problems, their own views, their own issues. You both have seen this, but I'm especially interested in hearing about how, when you've had to change a direction, or you've had to set a vision or a direction for a group of people, what are some of the things that you rely on? How do you get there? How do you connect with the heart, as well as the head, in order to get people, moving in the direction that's going to be best for the organization?
So what I have found is transparency helps enable trust. And a lot of times in companies, this is confidential. This is confidential. Well, a lot of times I would question that, because I'm like, well, if it's going to impact the employees, like if it's going to impact the money that they make, if it's going to impact, where they come to work, these are things they need to know. And I had a situation once where our bonuses were not going to be great. And COO and I, we discussed it. And he was of the thought, well, we'll tell them when it's time. And I was like, well, I think we better tell them now, because we're like 8 months in advance of them even being able to get the bonus. Mm-hmm. And for me, I'd rather know, because then I can get my mindset ready. And then you won't start spending the money quite yet, right? Because I might not get it. So my CEO and I, we'd have these dialogues. And a lot of times he would say to me, he's like, let me sleep on it. And then the next day he'll come in and he'll say, you know what? I think we need to go with that idea.
You got a point.
And then what would happen is the employees were so appreciative of that. And I was also coming into an organization that sometimes you would find out what's going on at the corporation in the newspaper to within the company. I'm like, they should know first. There's nothing that the media should know before the people that work here. You just, because it's a surprise factor. You don't want to, pick up the paper and read about your company. So I knew that I was going in with that, because that creates a lack of trust. So by going in and just giving them a heads up about things that are happening in advance, that helped a great deal. And to your point, just in general, you have to also remember communication. People understand things in different ways. And, we have email coming at us left and right. You also have to know what's the right vehicle to communicate to people. Sometimes it is email. Sometimes it's like, hey, 15-minute huddle. Because sometimes you just have to look at people and have a dialogue, let them know you're a real person. The other thing is being collaborative, I believe also engenders trust. And in being collaborative, that means everyone is not going to get their wish list of what they want. And in communicating, this is the decision. Let me tell you why we've made that decision. And I know some of the other options you were looking for were A, B, and C. Let me explain why we're not going to go with those, as opposed to where someone just comes in the room and says, this is what we're doing. And they act as if this collaboration now you wasted the collaboration. Use it for good.
Gisele, we love talking to you. You're so gracious with your time. Time has flown by. We want to be also respectful of your time. We know you got meetings still. Perhaps a couple of last questions from my side. Look, successful lady, not a day over 29. However, what advice would you give your younger self, someone 25-year-old Gisele? What advice would you give her?
I would say find someone to help you work through your career, because you haven't had your career before, but someone has. Whether that's a mentor or a sponsor or a coach. I think a coach is great because that person is actually invested in you personally and professionally. So that's one thing that I would say. Secondarily, I would say, don't be afraid to get to know people that are different from you.
Great advice.
And then third, never stop learning. because things change every day. And, I was a management information systems major, doesn't even exist anymore, right? But I guess they call it information science now.
Yeah. IS or IT.
Or IT, yeah. And, it would be very different today. So I would have to be, I couldn't rely on what I learned in undergrad to go into an IT role today. So it goes back to what you were saying, Phil, about, always being intellectually curious. Mm-hmm. And I never believe I know everything. Find ways to keep yourself current, because that's how, also another way that you'll be recognized by others in a positive way.
It's great advice. Carlos, last words?
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time with us. I am certain that there's going to be more than one or two people who will listen to the advice that you've given on just a host of things and really take from that some things that really will help them with their own careers. So I genuinely appreciate your willingness to share and be so frank with it. Thank you.
You're most
Absolutely. Welcome. Gisele, once again, thank you so much for sharing your insights, experience, and knowledge. We'd love to have you back, hopefully in the future, that we can talk about many things down the road. But until then, folks, this has been another episode of Business Fusion. Be good and do good. Bye-bye.